We're going to take a sort of behavioral science approach to e-commerce. Hopefully, if everyone in the room sort of knows a little bit about behavioral science, even if you don't know that's what it's called, because psychology is infinitely bound up with what we do, right? So this is me. I've been all sorts of things. I've worked, like I said, worked in agencies for a little while. My background's in cognitive behavioral science. Got into UX through having a fantastic mentor. I knew nothing about UX before I started in this world. I did an English degree, had no technical skills, like nothing whatsoever. And I was at a Christmas party and there was people in the room that were talking about UX and they sounded like the most interesting people in the room, so I kind of gravitated towards them and learned that there was this job at the intersection of psychology, design, and technology, and it was kind of awesome. And the people that I was surrounded with happened to be sort of experts in behavioral science, and I sort of absorbed and learned things over time. What I'm going to talk to you about today, because the sort of scope of behavioral science is so massive in what we do, is purely about the world of e-commerce and how we can sort of tactically deploy different behavioral science tactics to sort of get momentum through that space. So in about 25 minutes, what we're going to cover off is, first of all, just how big e-commerce is, just how massive it's got, particularly after the pandemic, and why that might be. Then we're going to look at how sort of years of various cognitive behavioral science understanding and learnings has kind of conditioned how we purchase stuff whilst we're moving through an e-commerce funnel. And then we're going to look at basically, does that hold up to scrutiny? So like, is it bollocks basically? Can we dismantle it? Can we see what happens when stakeholders, for example, say, well, no, that's never going to work for our business, and how we can sort of weaponize it if it deserves to be weaponized. So we'll start with chapter 1, the infinite high street. So we'll take this to be the internet. And using some very rough maths, you can reasonably say that the internet weighs about the size of a medium egg, which is to say that all the electrons whizzing around in cyberspace at any given time is about 50 grams, and that is about the size of a medium egg. So to stretch that metaphor even further, you could say that a large proportion of that egg, let's call it the yolk, is dedicated to e-commerce. And it's no surprise that that's the case, because it's one of the easiest ways to monetize cyberspace. This is all pretty obvious to us, right? And ever since COVID, to be honest, there's been this sort of global shift that's catalyzed the e-commerce market that is strongly localized in the UK. It is the fastest growing marketplace in the world. Again, no surprise. In the UK alone, the valuation of all the purchases in the e-commerce world is about 220 billion at the moment, and 1 in 5 purchases is happening online. When I first did this presentation, the forecast was that NASDAQ forecast that by the end of next year, 95% of all purchases ever will be conducted online. I don't think that's going to be the case if we're at 1 in 5 now, but it's interesting that that's how much, that's the view of the future, was that retail is just going to die a death. And it makes sense, right? Because e-commerce has a whole bunch of benefits that retail can't have. So apart from like reviews and delivery, next day delivery and all that kind of stuff, and the fact you don't have to leave your home, there's also an element, psychologically speaking, of kind of privacy and protection and distance from the cash you're spending that we don't have when we're in a retail store. It's probably no surprise that men tend to buy Viagra at a rate 10 times more online than they would do in a pharmacy, because you're protected identity-wise from the embarrassment that may or may not entail. Similarly, we spend more online because the sheer act of getting cash out or tapping your card on a contactless pay terminal symbolizes letting go of cash. You don't have that when you're just clicking a button. So it's no wonder that e-commerce in and of itself is this booming industry. And if you've seen Wreck-It Ralph, I think it's Wreck-It Ralph 2 that visualizes it this way. So he flies into the router and they kind of careen through this world of what they call it the infinite highway, this infinite high street of adverts and e-commerce platforms. And it's great and it's fun, and it's very visual, and all of us are very familiar with it because we're bombarded with ads for it all the time. The reason why I like this is because it's visualized as this sort of convoluted, wild world in this film, but it's not experienced like that. None of us actually experience it as overly confusing. We don't think about the number of touch points that we go through. We just do it, right? It doesn't actually register that you're doing this linear journey and you're maybe looping back to one touch point that you may have anchored on in the past. But if you're a marketer, or if you work in UX, or if you work in design, there is a problem with this, which is that from an analytical standpoint, if we try and observe what's going on, the entire ecosystem is messy. So this is Google's terminology, the messy middle. That is the kind of formless mass that all of these touch points in the e-commerce world clump together to be. And and it's kind of inscrutable. It's inscrutable to anyone that's not like inside the brain of the customer. And in fact, Google kind of articulated it this way. They referred to that messy middle as the space of abundant information and unlimited choice that shoppers have learned to manage easily using a range of cognitive shortcuts. So there's a massive amount of touch points. It's not confusing to you. It is confusing to the people that are trying to understand the you at the other end of the screen. And we use these biases, these cognitive shortcuts, to navigate through it. And we'll come back to that word in particular in a minute. So, how much of this is science? And if it is science, how much of it is behavioral science? Google actually did some science on this study. And I love this study. It's going to come up again later, because basically the thing that I've been harping on about for about 10 years has sort of finally been vindicated. This was a 2-year longitudinal study that Google did maybe 2 years ago now, maybe 2 or 3 years ago. They took 250 odd participants from every kind of cross-section of society. They analyzed 310 odd purchase journeys, that is, every online and offline purchase journeys through 30 plus products and services, everything from shampoo to insurance to buying a SIM card. And what they found as a 2-year-long study was that this was their kind of final summation. There are no typical journeys. There are just a confused set of touch points that we liken to spaghetti. And this is Google. Google processes the equivalent of 100 million filing cabinets worth of data every single day. And they're saying, we don't know. So that's kind of fascinating and slightly worrying, if you're Google and you're supposed to be this kind of, have this cult-like adherence to data. And to me, this kind of sums up the great paradox of UX design and of marketing innovation, which is that as our ability to measure stuff has gone up, our ability to comprehend what it's saying kind of goes down in kind. And you can think about this. 5 years ago, everyone was ranting and raving about big data. It's not like big data has now meant that we have infinitely better experiences. In fact, the fact that that word isn't even in common parlance anymore just goes to show that we're kind of overwhelmed by what it stands for. It's not like having more information has resulted in always better products and services. And it makes sense. You have these precision tools that you can look back into the past with, but who can reasonably expect it to stitch those together in any kind of meaningful way? I suppose AI might be able to get us close to there now, and we'll kind of see that play out. But this, to me, is this kind of central frustrating paradox that as precision goes up and volume goes up, our ability to comprehend what we're looking at goes down. In that same study, this was just one example of one person's network of touch points that they went through whilst buying. I think this was shampoo, actually. So this is one woman. She went through 80 touch points, 80. Search engines, review sites, blogging sites, publishers, retailer websites, texting friends, all manner of things. It's this kind of chaotic library of interaction points. And again, not confusing to her, confusing to us when we're trying to dissect and diagnose what's going on. So this is interesting, and this is a problem that we have to solve. So it kind of begs the question, or the thing that interests me about this is how do you diagnose this, right? We know what the state of play is. How do you diagnose it? And the thing that I want to sort of impart to you guys tonight is that I don't actually think we need to. Not all the time, anyway. You can just treat it. So to use a pharmacological metaphor, you think of like broad spectrum antibiotics. That is an antibiotic that treats something without necessarily knowing what the thing is, right? It's predicated on a well-trodden scientific philosophy called empirical therapy. That is basically, does it work in experience? If yes, continue doing the thing, right? And we know it's not perfect. We know there are sometimes better to have like targeted antibiotics, but a broad spectrum antibiotic or a broad spectrum solution that works and solves the problem for people is, to my mind, just as good as a specific one, especially if this one is cheaper and potentially more fun. And this is where behavioral science comes in. So just in case there's not sort of clarity around what behavioral science is, I'll just kind of define the terms. Behavioral science in general is the sum total of all kind of study of the field of human behavior, how we interact with people and the world around us, how we interact with everyone around us. Behavioral economics is how we take that information about how we all relate to one another and we kind of package it up and look at how that informs our ability to make decisions, particularly in making decisions under conditions of uncertainty, which shopping online very much is. And then nudge theory, which is what you might have heard of, I guess, in the UX world, is the intentional use of those principles to nudge people towards a desired outcome. So Andy talked about dark patterns briefly. These can be wielded for good, these can be wielded for evil. They're quite often wielded for evil. We introduce policy like GDPR to stop it being wielded for evil. But that is kind of the breakdown of behavioral science. And the reason why that works, to quote Rory Sutherland, is that our perception is leaky. That is, we are completely affected by the circumstances around us all the time. So I'll give a kind of classic example. Many people will have seen this. Optical illusions are a great parallel because they sort of instantly hit and they make sense. It's like a visual bias. We have the same visual biases in our cognitive system. Squares A and square B, they are the same color. Most people say that no, they aren't the same color, but if you take away the context, then you can see that actually the shadow and the fact that there's this big cylinder casting a shadow over it makes it look like they are two different colors. But I promise you they are the same. That's kind of a classical one. That's in all kind of psych textbooks. This one was more interesting. This did the rounds on Facebook or on social media a little while ago. Those two squares are the same color, which I was like, no, they're not the same color. But they are. Again, take away the context and you'll find that they're the same color. You take away the shadows and the contextual information and all of a sudden you've got a visual illusion that you can kind of switch your brain on and off from. So we see this play out all the time in psychology and we know it all, and marketers tend to know it really well even if they don't know the names of the things. Framing effects. You're not going to buy a yogurt that says I'm 40% full of fat, but you probably would buy one that says 6% fat-free. It's the same thing, it's just contextually reframed. We know that when we prime people to read the 10 Commandments before filling out their tax return, the instance of fraud drops lower, right? Because they're reminded of a moral principle. Happens even if you're an atheist, by the way, which is quite interesting. We also know, this is a famous one in behavioral science, a lot of you may have heard of this organ donation study. Germany and Austria, two adjoining countries. One of those countries, Germany, has like a 10 to 20% rate of organ donation. That is 10 to 20% of the country has volunteered to donate their organs after they die. And Austria next door has like a 99% rate of people that are giving their organs. But both countries say with near 100% certainty that they think organ donation is a good thing. And the reason for that is, despite sharing a border and sharing a language, etc., one country has an opt-in policy and one country has an opt-out policy, and people tend to be inherently lazy. So if you're born and by default you're an organ donor and you know that's a good thing, it's a hassle to have to opt out. But if you're born and you're not an organ donor and you have to go to an office and tick a box to become one, you're very unlikely to do it, even if you know it's the right thing. So these are the power of defaults. There's a ton of these. If you look up cognitive behavioral biases, you'll find an absolute ton of them. And they're all kind of interrelated. You can group them in different ways. But most of us are not designing policy, right? So what does this mean in an interface perspective? That one in particular means that people rarely deviate from pre-filled controls. So this is a kind of classic example. You install Dropbox. It says there are two types of settings, one of which is typical, brackets recommended, and it's already highlighted. The other says advanced, and it's not highlighted. So Dropbox doesn't know what my needs are, obviously. It doesn't know if I'm a typical user or an advanced user, but everything about this is telling me that I shouldn't really veer away from the one that's pre-selected because it seems like the right thing to do. We have this over tendency to stick with the default rather than change to something that we don't necessarily know about. It's because it costs us to have to think about it. If anyone's read Daniel Kahneman, you'll know about these different mental processes of kind of effortful thinking and non-effortful thinking. We tend to think that the things that people recommend are recommended for a reason, even when they're not. So we just won't change from the default. This one's quite a useful one because most people don't want to use those advanced features. When I was living in Australia, I opened a bank account and they opted me in, or by default, they turned on an overdraft setting, which meant that if I went into my overdraft, I'd be charged an insane interest rate on that overdraft. Luckily, you can't do that anymore. Various data protection policies have stopped that from being a thing. But this is a harmful example of using defaults to nudge people into a particular behavior. So that's how it kind of plays out in the social space. I'm going to talk about two kind of monolithic entities and two case studies. The Amazon one, I imagine a lot of you might have heard of. The Google one is related to that study, and you might not have heard of it. So hopefully there's something interesting to pick up here. Amazon one, also known as the $300 million button. So it's back in 2008, 2009. iPhone 3G had just come out. Early days of sort of e-commerce. And Amazon have this problem. They've got tons of data. UX as a discipline, at least under that name, didn't really exist in the way that it does today. But they had this problem where they realized that people were chucking stuff into their cart. they were going to checkout, and then they were dropping off. And this was the flow, by the way. Once you clicked proceed to checkout, you get presented with a form where you'd have to input your email address and password or sign up to an Amazon account. Amazon didn't think this was that much of a problem. Granted, we know this is a problem now, but this is 2008. They didn't know this was a problem. They thought that people would appreciate the expediency of coming back because Amazon was going to be like the place that sells everything from A to Z. They thought that people wouldn't mind a small interaction cost at this stage. They thought that, it was problem-free. So they brought in Jared Spool, I think it was, or at least his company at the time, to do a whole bunch of usability tests. And they're experts in behavioral science as well, so they did not just usability tests, they looked at the analytics, they got people to do a kind of cognitive walkthrough, a live cognitive walkthrough of purchasing stuff online, both repeat and new customers. And they found the stuff that we might find predictable today, which is people saying, I'm not here to enter into a relationship, I just want to buy something. They're worried about being spammed, they're worried maybe they'd signed up before. But even the repeat customers came back and found that a whole bunch of them had already had multiple registrations in the system, so there was a problem with the sign-up flow. And there was 160,000 forgotten password requests a day, 75% of which didn't come back to the website anyway. So no one was getting a good experience of this one tiny bit of friction. So they changed one thing. And that one thing was they got rid of the form and they put in a button and this bit of copy. So now you chuck something in your cart, you proceed to checkout, you get a continue button that says, just continue, no need to sign up. You do not need to create an account to make a purchase on our site. I've done another version of this where you can break down the behavioral science behind all of this. What's happening on the your far right, is you're being reminded of your sense of freedom. We love to be reminded of our sense of liberty. We hate it when an authority figure tells us not to do something. It's why the youth don't respond to police pressure. It's because they're seen as an authority figure. In this instance, Amazon was the authority figure telling you, you cannot pass unless you impart with some data with us. So by taking that away and reminding people of their own freedom, all of a sudden the throughput is massive. And it really was massive. So nearly 50% additional customers purchasing per month, which amounted to an annual revenue increase of $300 million, attributed specifically to the site, and 15 million in extra purchases from the first month, plus more signups. Right? So the actual thing that they were trying to get people to do happened anyway. If you haven't heard that study before, it's like the go-to study for like small changes, big impact, and it kind of justifies our whole career as far as I'm concerned. At the other end of the spectrum, you've got Google, 10 years later, conducting this longitudinal study. And as part of that longitudinal study to look at the messy middle, they wanted to run a simulation experiment on an e-commerce platform, a fictional e-commerce platform, to understand, is it possible to influence people's behavior in the messy middle, even when you can't see what's going on? Like, that's the problem. Going back to the kind of, can we treat it if we can't diagnose it? So what they did, they had a bunch of behavioral biases to test. I probably won't go through all of them, but essentially, there are some in here, social proof. Most of us have probably heard of social proof. We tend to follow the wisdom of the crowd. There's about 5 different types of social proof, depending on whether the people you're following are your peers, or someone who's an expert in the field, or whether it's someone who's got sort of a tenured position in the field. Lots of different types, but if all your mates are doing it, you're going to do it. That's why reviews exist. Scarcity, if something's running out, we're going to go for it a bit quicker. Airline websites and gig websites weaponize this to make you buy tickets thinking there's fewer left. It's not always true. Ryanair have been done for that. Authority bias is why there's dentists on toothpaste adverts, right? You think that this dentist must know something, so therefore you're going to buy it. Free, we disproportionately value the power of free. Similarly, the power of now, getting something instantly, something Mariah, you probably experienced with the change in delivery expectations. People want it now. And category heuristics is interesting. So that's like, if you're buying a mobile phone, there's like 1,000 technical specifications that might be relevant to your decision. But I worked with Samsung for a couple of years, and there's only 3 that people care about, which is camera, resolution, screen size, and battery life. It's not that the other ones don't exist, it's just that the heuristics, the rules of thumb that people stick to are those 3. So if you know what the category heuristics are, you can elevate them in the copy, you can elevate them in the design, and encourage people to understand quicker. Google wanted to test the effect of all of these on various different studies inside the messy middle. So they created, I might have turned this off, there we go. Right, so they created a fictional e-commerce platform. I just designed this, it didn't actually look like this, they don't actually show what it looked like. But essentially they got a bunch of people in and they gave them a category to buy in, like in this instance I think it was beauty products. And they said, what's your favorite beauty brand, and someone might say, I don't know, Dove or something. So they put on the website a Dove branded product, and it has a bunch of proof points, just like any e-commerce website might do. And they say to them, imagine money was no object, would you buy this product? And everyone's like, yeah, of course I'd buy this product because it's Dove, and I've just told you that Dove's my favorite brand. So great, nothing uncertain there. So then they introduce another brand, I don't know, Nivea or something, and they say, okay, now, which of these two brands would you buy? And this was where the first weird thing started happening, which is that just by introducing the second brand, 30% of people change. They say, oh, I'll buy the other brand. I'd go for something different. Which is essentially the business case for any kind of marketing. Just by being there, you're going to grab 30% of people's attention just from existing. So this is why you do above-the-line advertising. This is why you do onboarding emails and newsletters. You just have to shout in the echo chamber to get people to switch their preference. So then they started looking at what they're going to do, or what would happen if they started kind of charging the proof points with behavioral biases. So now where it was a free sample, it's now free shipping, which they knew at the time had greater salience and more importance. Organic changed to natural ingredients. That's a category heuristic that performs better in that particular category. So they wanted to see if by kind of just dialing up the biases, whether or not people would switch their brand preference even more. And now you have something really wild happening where nearly 60% of people transfer their preference from the thing they just said that is their number one brand to the other one just because it's been charged up by these kind of behavioral nudges. So then they supercharge brand B, right? They go, well, it's now the winner of a beauty award and it's got a 4 out of 5 star review. There's only 2 left, there's next day delivery, parking ethics for a moment. They just wanted to see whether or not this would actually work. And what happened is ridiculous. So 90% of people now switch from their first choice preference brand to the second when all the biases are applied. So brand equity is sort of destroyed. People are willing to change what their self-stated preferences to something completely random and different just by changing the context around which that thing is marketed. For kind of good balance, Google did this again with the second brand was a fake one, right? So they could take out all the kind of brand equity of Nivea, for example, and just made up a brand. Doesn't exist, has no equity, has no marketing, has no real proof points. And when you run the study, even with a fake brand, you still find that 50% of people switch their preference from brand A to brand B, which is kind of mind-blowing. And they did it across every possible category you can imagine, from buying a car to getting a SIM card to buying a TV to buying a house, buying a flight, everything. And every single category demonstrated the same shift in brand preference when you've kind of supercharged the product that you're selling with these biases. I find that kind of slightly scary, to be honest, because all the stuff we think about, or if you're a marketer, all the stuff you think about like building up a brand is sort of at the disposal of the context in which it's presented. So the question this kind of begs to me is like, to what extent should we sort of buy into this? Should we fully believe this? Should we just go behavioral science is the solution to all problems? Should we be tactical about everything and not strategic about anything else? That's clearly not the right answer. But what I would say about this is every time I've kind of worked with behavioral scientists or tried to use behavioral science in these kind of small tactical windows, I get a lot of pushback. And the pushback usually comes in the form of something like this. It's not truly customer-centric. We're human-centered design agency or client or brand, right? We want to do research with our users. And I'm a researcher by trade. I'm not absolutely not bad-mouthing research. But this is more customer-centric than anything you're going to do because it's got decades of science behind it. It's got statistical robustness that usually we can't achieve. It's scientifically rigorous in a way that not all of us are trained to do it. And it's tested with real humans, and we know that to be a fact. It's peer-reviewed. It's under constant scrutiny. It's funded by more than anyone's sort of annual design budget would usually allow for. Now, there is a replication crisis. There's a caveat to this happening at the moment where some of these psychological theories are being shown to be not as effective as they were before, or they were in the 70s when it was kind of booming. We can kind of go into that. There's some things that have survived that, some things that haven't, some things that have gone down in sort of efficacy. But usually, we're talking about conversion rate optimization, at least in e-commerce. All those people, Mariah, that you're talking about that care about conversion and volume, a 0.1% increase in something really matters. So even if these only work to a tiny degree, working to a tiny degree multiplied at the scale that we're reaching people, it makes a big difference. What about people saying, we can't just change our products, right? We can't just change what we sell. I think you don't have to, right? There's hundreds of these biases available. We've gone through about 6 of them. This is way easier to execute on than actually changing a product. They're mostly just cosmetic changes or copy changes or design changes. They can be A/B tested really quickly. It's easier to use behavioral science than it is to go through a whole massive long research project just to get to a conclusion that might be ambiguous. And this is my favorite one, right? So it can't outperform our data modeling. We have all this data. We've got data scientists who can look at this data and make sense of it. Your heuristics, your small tweaks can't beat this. This is just patently not true. And if I've got time, where's the time? Okay. If I've got time, I was going to show you an example where basically less is more. So we actually know that heuristics, rules of thumb, singular, principle-driven ideas outperform masses of data by infinite degrees, right? We know that they perform better. Simplicity outperforms complexity. And we kind of have to get over this illusion that a complex problem necessarily needs a complex solution. Just because we've got more variables doesn't necessarily mean we need to use them all. Just because the people are complex doesn't necessarily mean that designing for them has to be. This is only true, by the way, when looking into the future. If you're looking into the past at the data you've had, then data modeling works perfectly. That should be used to analyze what you've got. But when it comes to making predictions about the future, vast data modeling does underperform. I think I have time to show you this one. Yeah, okay, so this is my favorite case study. Back in 2000 and, when was it? 2008. Bad year, it seems, with the Amazon case study as well. So Google are doing this thing where they want to see if they can predict flu outbreak. This was before pandemic, which makes this even more interesting. Everyone's chucking in a bunch of keywords into Google all the time. Some of those people are getting sick. They can map that data and they can see, are there certain keywords that correlate to more people getting more sick? And can we predict the next flu outbreak by looking at all the keywords? So they distill all these keywords down into this massive algorithm. They see if they can use it they claim they can use it to forecast the spread of future outbreaks. And then 2009 comes along, swine flu hits out of season, so it wasn't in the winter, and Google misses it entirely. Despite having this incredible algorithm, they just miss it because it wasn't within the regular cadence of the keywords that kind of came before it. So they increased the number of predictors from 45 variables from their data set to over 160. They calibrate that model over 160 years. The perfect example of going more data, more complexity, more power, as it were. By 2013, Google fails to predict the flu season by an error margin of 140%, which is substantially worse than if you just tossed a coin or asked any one of us in this room when the next flu outbreak would be. So later on that year, they quietly retire the program. This is like a perfect example, again, of how a vast amount of analytics can seduce us into thinking that we have an answer, or an answer is there, we just can't see it. And that's what I think is just not true. The guy who said that thing about more data or more complex ideas doesn't necessarily result in more complex solutions, did a study on the Google flu trends case study. What he did was he took a single heuristic, a single rule of thumb called the recency heuristic, which is basically you look at Google search data and you say, are the number of people searching for GP appointments more frequent now than they were 2 weeks ago? So it's a single metric, just more of people searching for GP appointments now compared to 2 weeks ago. And by using that as a predictor, he tested that on the Google flu trends data that they had to see if it fit. And it outperformed their model 10 times, right? So a single parameter outdoes what Google tried to do in, what's that, like 6 years or something, dramatically. It's useful to know this, right? Because I've spent a lot of time working with data scientists who do things that I can't do, but whenever they start talking about what people have done in the past means that this is what they're going to do in the future, it instantly have a sort of skeptical radar go up. All big data comes from the same place, which is the past. So this is all well and good, but, and it's a big but, there's more to this, right? So none of this will ever be a substitute for extensive, detailed research. This is very much going to attack pretty much just the conversion part of your e-com journey. It's going to be the tactical stuff. It's going to be the nudging people from one small moment to the next small moment. It's not going to change people's beliefs. It's not going to change people's responsiveness to whether or not whether they want to use a thing or not in the first place. It's purely tactical, and I think we should make sure that we wield it like that. Like, it'll never be a substitute for spending all that time understanding the pain points, which is why it just exists as this kind of tiny little bit of the wider ecosystem. It is cheaper, it does save on post-it notes, so it's a practice worth wielding, but don't substitute it for kind of everything else. And there's a lot of everything else. We've talked about quite a lot of it. Andy talked about it in ethnographic research is huge. Contextual inquiry was all I did pre-pandemic and before things moved online. Seeing how where people put their post-it notes over time, even in their home environment, is super useful for understanding what their mental model is outside of just what's going on the screen. So it's only a small part of the puzzle. Keep behavioral nudges in the back of your mind, but keep primary qualitative research there as well. Focus on understanding those customer pain points and do it continuously. I'm a massive fan of continuous discovery. It is hard to do. It's quite nice if you don't have a specific question that you always have to answer. If you can be flexible in what that question is, it's fantastic. Agencies don't get to do that much because we're sort of 2 steps behind the client. And then leave room for creativity as well. I think like a lifetime in agencies has made me realize that like creatives sort of think that UX exists to sort of shit all over their ideas, which is never the case. Like, we want it to be usable, but I don't want to ruin the creativity. In fact, UX has a tendency to kind of homogenize everything with templates and best practices. So like creativity becomes paramount as everything kind of converges on one point. So yeah, that's worth bearing in mind. Hopefully you've learned a little bit about behavioral nudges. If you want to know more, give me a nudge. Thank you.